March 24, 1945. The skies over Berlin burn with the exhaust of 1,000 bomber engines, their formations stretching across the horizon like steel clouds. Below, the capital of the Third Reich smolders under relentless Allied bombardment. Above, Captain Roscoe Brown adjusts his oxygen mask and scans the sky through the bulletproof glass of his North American P-51 Mustang. The red-painted tail behind him gleams in the morning sun, marking him as one of the Tuskegee Airmen, America's segregated but elite fighter squadron. German pilots have been calling them schwarze Vogelmänner, black birdmen, mocking their race while dismissing their skill. Today, that arrogance will cost the Luftwaffe dearly. Brown's squadron has already scored over 100 aerial victories, proving that American training, industrial might, and sheer determination can overcome any enemy advantage. The war in Europe is nearly over, but this final battle will cement a legacy that transcends victory itself. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning air at Ramatelli Airfield carried the sharp bite of aviation fuel mixed with the earthy smell of Italian countryside. Captain Roscoe Brown pulled on his leather flight helmet, the worn interior molded to his skull after hundreds of missions over enemy territory. Around him, the distinctive whine of Packard Merlin engines filled the pre-dawn darkness as North American P-51 Mustangs warmed up for another escort mission deep into German airspace. Brown walked the flight line, inspecting each red-painted tail that marked his squadron as the Tuskegee Airmen. These crimson identifiers had become legendary among bomber crews who depended on their protection. The segregated nature of their unit meant they fought two wars simultaneously, one against fascism in the skies over Europe, another against prejudice from their own military establishment. The P-51 Mustang represented the pinnacle of American fighter design. Its Packard V1650 Merlin engine generated 1,290 horsepower, pushing the aircraft to 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. More importantly, its 1,650-mile range allowed escort missions that penetrated deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns provided devastating firepower, each weapon capable of firing 750 rounds per minute. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Davis approached through the morning mist, his command bearing evident even in the dim light. As squadron commander, Davis had transformed a group of college-educated pilots into one of the most effective fighter units in the Mediterranean theater. His presence reminded every pilot that they carried the hopes of an entire race on their wings. The mission briefing revealed their destination, Berlin itself. Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators would strike aircraft factories, while the Red Tails provided escort protection. Intelligence reports indicated strong Luftwaffe resistance, including the new Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters that could outrun conventional propeller aircraft. Brown climbed into his cockpit, the familiar routine of startup checks and instrument verification calming his nerves. The Mustang's cockpit represented American technological superiority. Clear plexiglass canopy for maximum visibility, reliable instrumentation, and ergonomic controls that allowed pilots to focus on combat rather than aircraft management. As engines reached operating temperature, the formation prepared for takeoff. The bombers were already climbing north toward their targets, their crews depending on red tail protection to bring them home alive. Brown advanced his throttle, feeling 1,190 horses of American engineering pull him down the runway and into the dawn sky. The formation climbed steadily through broken clouds, each Mustang maintaining precise position relative to its wingman. Years of training at Tuskegee Institute and combat experience over North Africa and Italy had forged these pilots into a disciplined fighting force. They would not abandon their charges to chase individual glory or pursue fleeing enemies beyond escort range. The Ford Willow Run plant stretched across 3.5 million square feet of Michigan farmland, its assembly lines running 24 hours daily to feed America's insatiable appetite for war production. The thunderous rhythm of pneumatic Rivet guns echoed through cavernous halls where women and men transformed raw aluminum into instruments of liberation. Rosie, the Riveter, was more than propaganda. She represented the mobilization of American industrial capacity that would prove decisive in determining victory. At peak production, Willow Run completed one consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. This impossible statistic meant that, in a single day, American workers produced more heavy bombers than Germany manufactured in an entire month. The assembly line method, pioneered by Henry Ford for automobile production, revolutionized military manufacturing. Components moved continuously through specialized stations where workers performed specific tasks with machine-like precision. This approach eliminated the craftsman mentality that limited European aircraft production, replacing it with standardized processes that could be scaled infinitely. Raw materials flowed into Willow Run from across the American continent. Aluminum came from Pacific Northwest smelters powered by Columbia River hydroelectric dams. Steel arrived from Pittsburgh mills that had expanded beyond peacetime capacity. Rubber, rationed for civilian use, poured into military contracts that equipped every American bomber with hundreds of tires, gaskets, and electrical components. The workforce itself demonstrated American abundance. Unlike Germany, which increasingly relied on slave labor and conscripted teenagers, American factories attracted voluntary workers with competitive wages and overtime pay. Women entered the industrial workforce in unprecedented numbers, performing precision work that matched or exceeded male productivity standards. Quality control procedures ensured that every aircraft met exacting specifications. Test pilots flew completed bombers through demanding evaluation flights that verified performance characteristics. Engine run-ups confirmed power output, while stress tests validated structural integrity. This systematic approach produced reliable aircraft that could survive combat conditions and bring crews home safely. Production statistics revealed the scale of American commitment. In 1944 alone, United States factories completed 96,318 military aircraft of all types. This output dwarfed German production of approximately 40,000 aircraft during the same period. Despite Germany's head start in rearmament and industrial preparation, the economic foundation supporting this production miracle rested on abundant natural resources and surplus industrial capacity. American factories could expand production without reducing civilian goods to starvation levels. Workers maintained adequate nutrition and housing, ensuring sustained productivity throughout the war effort. Transportation networks moved completed aircraft from factories to combat theaters with remarkable efficiency. The Alaska-Siberia ferry route delivered thousands of fighters and bombers to Soviet forces. Atlantic convoys carried aircraft to British bases, while Pacific shipping supplied Australian and Chinese allies. Each rivet installed at Willow Run carried the promise of American protection to Allied aircrews flying over hostile territory. The abundance that characterized American production would prove that democracy's industrial capacity could overwhelm totalitarian military advantages through sheer volume and technological superiority. The Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg operated under conditions that would have been unimaginable to American workers. Bomb damage from repeated Allied raids left gaping holes in production halls, while power failures interrupted assembly schedules. Workers coughed constantly in the dusty air, their productivity declining as nutrition deteriorated and working hours extended beyond human endurance. German aircraft production faced shortages that became more severe with each passing month. Aluminum supplies, disrupted by bombing of transportation networks, forced manufacturers to substitute inferior materials that compromised aircraft performance. The synthetic fuel program, intended to replace petroleum imports, produced aviation gasoline with octane ratings insufficient for high-performance engines. The Messerschmitt Me 262 represented German technological brilliance constrained by material scarcity. This twin-engine jet fighter could reach 540 miles per hour, making it substantially faster than any Allied propeller aircraft. However, production numbers told a different story. Fewer than 1,400 E-262s were completed during the entire war, compared to over 15,000 North American P-51 Mustangs manufactured by the United States. Fuel shortages crippled German pilot training programs more severely than aircraft losses. By 1944, Luftwaffe pilots entered combat with as few as 25 hours of flight training, compared to 400 hours required for American pilots. This experience gap proved fatal when inexperienced. German pilots encountered veteran American squadrons with thousands of combat hours, the civilian population supporting German aircraft. Production suffered from rationing that reduced daily caloric intake below subsistence levels. Bread contained sawdust additives, while meat became unavailable except through black market channels. Women and elderly workers replaced men conscripted for military service, but their productivity declined as physical strength deteriorated. Transportation bottlenecks prevented efficient distribution of completed aircraft to operational units. Allied bombing of railway networks disrupted delivery schedules, while fuel shortages grounded completed fighters awaiting deployment. Many Me-262s never reached combat units, remaining at factories for lack of transportation or qualified pilots. The contrast with American abundance could not have been starker. While German workers subsisted on 1,200 calories daily, American factory employees enjoyed full nutrition that sustained maximum productivity. German synthetic fuel produced inferior performance, while American petroleum refineries supplied high-octane aviation, gasoline that enabled superior engine output, quality. Control procedures that ensured American aircraft reliability were impossible under German conditions. Component shortages forced acceptance of substandard parts, while production pressure eliminated thorough testing procedures. German aircraft reached operational units with defects that would have been unacceptable in American factories. Adolf Galland, commanding the German fighter force, recognized that technological superiority could not compensate for numerical disadvantage. His reports to High Command described a situation where individual German aircraft might outperform American equivalents, but overwhelming Allied numbers rendered such advantages meaningless. The industrial base supporting German aircraft production was crumbling under sustained Allied pressure. Every day brought new production challenges while American factories operated at peak efficiency. The mathematical inevitability of defeat became apparent to anyone willing to examine production statistics honestly. The contrails appeared as white streaks against azure sky, marking the approach of Messerschmitt Me-262 jets climbing toward the bomber formation. Captain Roscoe Brown adjusted his throttle settings, watching airspeed indicators as his North American P-51 Mustang responded to control inputs. The German jets approached with characteristic arrogance, their pilots confident that superior technology would overcome American numerical advantages. Radio chatter crackled through Brown's headset as German pilots taunted the escort fighters. Schwarze Vogelmänner, they called the Tuskegee Airmen, their voices heavy with contempt for America's segregated pilots. The insults carried additional venom, combining racial prejudice with military overconfidence that would prove fatally misguided. Brown's tactical training emphasized discipline over aggression. Unlike pursuit missions that prioritized individual kills, escort duty required maintaining protective formation around vulnerable bombers. This restraint contradicted natural fighter pilot instincts, but produced superior results in protecting Allied aircrews. The first Me-262s dove toward the bomber stream, its twin Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines producing 1,180 pounds of thrust each. Maximum speed of 540 miles per hour gave German jets substantial performance advantages over propeller-driven fighters. However, acceleration and turning characteristics favored the more maneuverable American aircraft at lower speeds. Brown executed a precise climbing turn that placed his Mustang in an intercept position. The German pilot, focused on bomber targets, failed to notice the approaching threat until 6 50-caliber machine guns opened fire at 300 yards range. Each Browning M2 fired 750 rounds per minute. creating a devastating cone of destruction that no aircraft could survive. The Me-262 disintegrated in a ball of orange flame, its wreckage tumbling toward the German countryside below. Brown's wingman confirmed the kill while maintaining formation discipline that kept remaining bombers under protective cover. This tactical approach distinguished Tuskegee operations from other fighter groups that prioritized individual achievements over mission success. Additional German jets pressed their attacks, but coordinated defensive maneuvers by red-tail pilots disrupted enemy formation integrity. American pilots used superior numbers and tactical coordination to overcome technological disadvantages. Radio communication allowed instant coordination of defensive responses that confused German attack plans. The engagement lasted 15 minutes before surviving German jets withdrew, their fuel consumption preventing extended combat operations. Me-262 endurance limitations meant brief attack windows, followed by mandatory return to base for refueling. These operational constraints reduced German combat effectiveness despite theoretical performance advantages. Brown's squadron reformed protective formation around the bomber stream, their mission discipline intact despite successful combat engagement. Bomber crews observed the professional competence that distinguished red-tail operations from other escort units. Loss rates under Tuskegee protection consistently fell below 8th Air Force averages. The victory demonstrated that superior training and tactical discipline could overcome technological advantages. German jets might fly faster, but American pilots flew smarter. Industrial abundance that provided adequate training. Time and fuel supplies created combat advantages that enemy technology could not. Match the situation map in Luftwaffe headquarters displayed a sobering picture of German air power decline. Red arrows marking Allied penetration routes covered most of Western Europe, while blue symbols indicating Luftwaffe strength had diminished to scattered isolated positions. Colonel Adolf Galland studied the intelligence reports with growing resignation as mathematical reality overwhelmed optimistic projections that aircraft loss rates exceeded replacement. Production by ratios that made recovery impossible. During October 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 1,013 aircraft, while German factories completed fewer than 800 replacements. This negative production balance meant steady attrition of experienced pilots and operational aircraft despite technological innovations like the Me-262 jet fighter. Fuel shortages had become more critical than aircraft availability. Synthetic fuel production, disrupted by Allied bombing raids, provided aviation gasoline with insufficient octane ratings for high-performance engines. Romanian petroleum fields, captured by Soviet forces, eliminated Germany's primary natural fuel source. Luftwaffe units possessed aircraft that could not fly due to fuel rationing. Pilot training programs collapsed under resource constraints that made adequate instruction impossible. Flight schools reduced training hours from 240 to fewer than 25 as fuel allocations dwindled. New pilots entered combat with minimal experience, while American counterparts completed 400 hours of training before operational assignment. This experience gap produced predictable combat results. Galland's reports to High Command described tactical situations where individual German aircraft might outperform Allied equivalents, but strategic mathematics favored overwhelming American production capacity. United States factories completed more aircraft in 1 month than Germany produced in 6 months, creating numerical advantages that rendered technological superiority irrelevant. The Me-262 program exemplified German strategic failures despite tactical innovations. Fewer than 1,400 jets were completed compared to over 15,000 American P-51 Mustangs. German jets might fly faster, but American fighters flew more frequently with better-trained pilots and adequate fuel supplies. Intelligence estimates of Allied production capacity revealed the futility of continued resistance. American industrial output exceeded German capacity by factors that made victory mathematically impossible. Ford's Willow Run plant alone produced more bombers than all German factories combined during peak production periods. Transportation networks supporting Luftwaffe operations deteriorated under sustained Allied pressure. Railway systems that moved aircraft from factories to operational bases suffered constant disruption from bombing raids. Completed aircraft remained at manufacturing facilities for lack of transportation, while combat units operated with reduced strength. Quality control procedures that ensured aircraft reliability were abandoned under production pressure and material shortages. German aircraft reached operational units with defects that would have been unacceptable under peacetime standards. Maintenance problems increased operational losses beyond combat casualties. Galland recognized that courage and skill could not compensate for industrial disadvantages that grew worse each month. German pilots might display superior individual talent, but systematic American advantages in training, equipment, and logistics produced inevitable defeat. The war had become a mathematical equation where German variables could not equal American constants. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress maintained steady course toward its target. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines generating the rhythmic thunder that bomber crews found both comforting and ominous. Staff Sergeant Robert Johnson, tail gunner on Memphis Belle, scanned the sky through his .50 caliber machine gun sight, watching for the distinctive red tails that marked their escort protection. Tuskegee Airmen had earned reputation among bomber crews for their unwavering commitment to escort discipline. Unlike other fighter groups that abandoned formation to pursue individual kills, Red Tail pilots maintained protective coverage that brought bombers home alive. This tactical approach produced measurable results in reduced loss rates and improved crew survival statistics. The escort formation weaved above and behind the bomber stream, North American P-51 Mustangs maintaining precise positions that provided overlapping defensive coverage. Captain Charles McGee led his flight with hand signals that coordinated defensive maneuvers without breaking radio silence. This professional competence distinguished Tuskegee operations from units that prioritized personal glory over mission success. Luftwaffe fighters appeared as distant specks climbing toward the formation, their approach vectors calculated to exploit defensive weaknesses. German tactics emphasized concentrated attacks that overwhelmed escort coverage through superior numbers at specific points. However, coordinated Red Tail responses disrupted these tactical plans through disciplined maneuvering that maintained protective integrity. The engagement developed with characteristic intensity as German fighters pressed their attacks despite escort resistance. McGee's squadron executed defensive weaves that placed American fighters between attackers and vulnerable bombers. Radio communication allowed instant coordination of tactical responses. That confused German formation planning. Johnson watched through his tail position as Red Tail pilots engaged multiple German fighters simultaneously. The professionalism displayed by Tuskegee pilots contrasted sharply with their treatment by military authorities who questioned their combat effectiveness based on racial prejudice rather than operational results. Bomber crew survival depended on escort effectiveness that could be measured in statistical terms. Units protected by Tuskegee fighters experienced loss rates consistently below 8th Air Force averages. This mathematical evidence contradicted institutional prejudice that had delayed African American participation in combat roles. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The formation continued toward its target despite German resistance that intensified as fighters approached industrial areas. Red Tail pilots maintained escort discipline even when tactical opportunities suggested abandoning protective formation for pursuit missions. This restraint reflected training that emphasized mission accomplishment over individual achievement. McGee's damaged Mustang continued flying despite engine problems that would have forced other pilots to abort their escort responsibilities. His determination to protect bomber crews exemplified the professional standards that characterized Tuskegee operations. Throughout the Mediterranean and European theaters, the successful completion of escort missions demonstrated that tactical discipline could overcome technological and numerical disadvantages. German fighters might possess superior individual performance characteristics, but coordinated American defensive tactics produced better operational results in protecting strategic bombing missions. The midnight shift at Ford's Willow Run plant operated under floodlights that turned night into harsh artificial day. Riveting guns hammered continuously as workers assembled consolidated B-24 Liberator bombers on production lines that moved with mechanical precision. The factory floor vibrated with industrial energy that represented American determination to overwhelm Axis war production. Through sheer manufacturing volume. Rose Monroe operated her riveting station with practiced efficiency, installing aluminum panels that would protect bomber crews over European battlefields. Each rivet represented a connection between American industrial capacity and Allied survival chances in hostile airspace. The quality of her work directly influenced whether aircrews returned home alive or became casualties of mechanical failure. Production statistics from Willow Run demonstrated manufacturing capabilities that exceeded German industrial capacity by overwhelming margins. At peak efficiency, the facility completed one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes around the clock. This impossible rate meant that American workers produced more heavy bombers in one day than German factories manufactured in an entire month. The workforce represented mobilized American society committed to total war effort. Women entered industrial jobs traditionally reserved for men, performing precision work that matched or exceeded previous productivity standards. Voluntary participation contrasted sharply with German reliance on slave labor and conscripted workers whose productivity declined under coercive conditions. Material abundance supporting American production came from continental resources that European nations could not match. Aluminum smelters in the Pacific Northwest used Columbia River hydroelectric power to process bauxite ore. Steel mills in Pittsburgh operated beyond peacetime capacity while maintaining quality standards, essential for aircraft structural integrity, transportation. Networks moved raw materials and completed aircraft with efficiency that German systems could not duplicate. Railway lines connected factories to ports where vessels carried bombers to combat theaters. The Alaska-Siberia ferry route delivered thousands of aircraft to Soviet allies, while Atlantic convoys supplied British bases with American-manufactured fighters and bombers. Quality control procedures ensured that every aircraft met specifications that would allow survival under combat conditions. Test pilots flew completed bombers through demanding evaluation flights that verified performance characteristics. Engine testing confirmed power output, while structural examinations validated load-bearing capabilities essential for combat. Operations economic foundations supporting this production. Miracle rested on surplus capacity that allowed military expansion without civilian hardship. American factories could increase output while maintaining adequate nutrition and housing for workers. This sustainability contrasted with German conditions where production increases required reducing civilian living standards below subsistence levels. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity became evident in comparative production statistics. United States aircraft manufacturing during 1944 totaled 96 380 military aircraft, while German production reached only 40,000 units despite Germany's earlier rearmament programs and industrial preparation. Monroe's shift ended with the satisfaction of knowing that her work contributed directly to Allied victory prospects. Each bomber completed at Willow Run carried this promise of American protection to aircrew members flying over hostile territory. Berlin's civilian population huddled in underground shelters as Allied bombers droned overhead in formations that stretched across the horizon. The systematic destruction of the German capital demonstrated Allied air superiority that the Luftwaffe could no longer challenge effectively. Anti-aircraft guns fired sporadically, their shells falling short of bomber formations flying at altitudes beyond effective reach. Rationing had reduced civilian food intake to levels that threatened basic survival. Bread contained sawdust additives, while meat became available only through black market channels that demanded payment in goods rather than increasingly worthless currency. Women and children stood in lines for hours to receive portions that would not sustain normal physical activity. Luftwaffe. Pilot training programs suffered from fuel shortages that made adequate instruction impossible. Flight schools reduced training hours from peacetime standards of 240 hours to fewer than 25 as aviation gasoline allocations dwindled. New pilots entered combat with minimal experience while their American opponents completed 400 hours of training before operational assignment. The contrast in pilot preparation produced predictable combat results. German pilots with inadequate training faced veteran American squadrons whose experience levels reflected abundant fuel supplies and systematic instruction programs. This experience gap translated directly into aerial combat outcomes that favored better prepared American air crews. Transportation networks supporting military operations deteriorated under sustained Allied bombing pressure. Railway systems that moved personnel and equipment between military installations suffered constant disruption from precision strikes. Completed aircraft remained at manufacturing facilities for lack of transportation, while operational units flew with reduced strength. Industrial production declined as bombing raids targeted synthetic fuel facilities and aircraft factories. The Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg operated with frequent power failures, while workers coughed in dusty air filled with debris from bomb damage. Production schedules became impossible to maintain as material shortages, and transportation disruptions prevented normal manufacturing. Civilian morale collapsed as Luftwaffe protection proved inadequate against sustained Allied air attacks. The promise of revolutionary weapons like the Me-262 jet fighter failed to materialize in numbers sufficient to affect combat outcomes. Citizens recognized that technological innovations could not compensate for overwhelming Allied numerical advantages. Black market activities flourished as official rationing systems failed to provide adequate supplies. Citizens traded family heirlooms for food, while government officials acknowledged privately that the war effort had become unsustainable. The social fabric that supported German resistance began unraveling under economic and military pressure. Medical facilities struggled with casualties from bombing raids, while pharmaceutical supplies dwindled. Hospitals operated without adequate heating or lighting as fuel allocations were directed toward military priorities. The civilian health crisis reflected broader resource allocation problems that affected all aspects of German society. Young boys and elderly men replaced experienced workers conscripted for military service. Their reduced productivity contributed to industrial decline that accelerated as Allied pressure intensified. The mobilization of inappropriate personnel demonstrated the desperation of German authorities facing inevitable defeat. The fires consuming Berlin cast orange reflections against the bellies of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses as they approached their targets in the German capital. Captain Charles McGee scanned the sky through his P-51 Mustang's canopy, watching for Luftwaffe interceptors that would challenge the massive bomber formations. His engine ran roughly after taking flak damage over the target area, but mission discipline required maintaining escort coverage until bombers reached safety. The strategic bombing campaign had achieved its objectives of crippling German industrial capacity and transportation networks. Synthetic fuel production, essential for Luftwaffe operations, had been reduced by 90% through precision strikes on refineries and chemical plants. This fuel shortage grounded more German aircraft than combat losses, making numerical superiority irrelevant when planes could not fly. Focke-Wulf 190 fighters appeared through broken clouds, their pilots attempting desperate attacks against the bomber stream despite hopeless numerical disadvantage. German tactics emphasized individual bravery over coordinated defensive strategy, reflecting pilot training programs that could no longer provide adequate instruction in formation flying and tactical coordination. McGee's Red Tail flight engaged the German fighters with precision that reflected hundreds of hours of combat experience. the Tuskegee pilots maintained escort discipline while engaging targets of opportunity, never abandoning their protective responsibilities to pursue fleeing enemies. This tactical restraint distinguished their operations from other fighter groups that prioritized individual achievements over mission success. The damaged German fighters broke off their attacks, their pilots recognizing the futility of continued resistance against overwhelming Allied numbers. Luftwaffe's strength had declined to scattered individual aircraft rather than coordinated squadrons capable of sustained combat operations. The systematic destruction of German pilot training programs meant that even available aircraft lacked qualified crews. Bomber formations continued toward their targets despite sporadic German resistance that posed minimal threat to mission completion. The industrial facilities below represented the remnants of German war production that had been systematically degraded through sustained Allied pressure. Aircraft factories operated at fraction of capacity, while transportation networks suffered constant disruption. McGee's engine problems worsened as coolant temperature rose beyond safe operating limits. Combat damage had penetrated his cooling system, but professional pride demanded maintaining escort coverage until bombers completed their mission. This dedication to duty exemplified the standards that characterized Tuskegee operations throughout their combat deployment. The formation turned toward home base after successful target identification and bomb release. German anti-aircraft fire had been sporadic and ineffective, reflecting ammunition shortages that prevented sustained defensive barrages. The systematic degradation of German defensive capabilities demonstrated the effectiveness of Allied strategic planning. Navigation toward friendly territory required careful attention to fuel consumption and engine parameters. McGee calculated that his damaged Mustang could reach Allied lines despite mechanical problems that would have forced earlier abortion of the mission. His determination reflected the professional competence that had earned respect from bomber crews depending on red tail protection. The successful completion of escort missions over Berlin represented the culmination of Allied air superiority that made German defeat inevitable. The post-war analysis of combat statistics revealed numbers that transformed historical understanding of aerial warfare effectiveness. Tuskegee Airmen had flown 15,533 combat sorties while achieving 112 confirmed aerial victories against Luftwaffe opposition. Their loss ratio of 66 pilots killed in action compared favorably to other 8th Air Force fighter groups operating under similar conditions. Bomber protection statistics demonstrated the tactical superiority of red tail escort methods. Loss rates for bomber formations under Tuskegee protection consistently fell below 8th Air Force averages, providing mathematical evidence of professional competence that contradicted institutional prejudice. These numbers represented lives saved through disciplined tactical execution rather than individual glory-seeking. American aircraft production totals revealed the industrial foundation that made Allied victory inevitable. United States factories completed 324 750 military aircraft during World War II compared to German production of approximately 119,871 aircraft. This 3-to-1 advantage reflected manufacturing capacity that enemy nations could not match despite technological innovations. The Ford Willow Run facility alone produced 8,685 consolidated B-24 Liberator bombers, exceeding total German heavy bomber production throughout the entire war. Peak production rates of one bomber every 63 minutes demonstrated manufacturing capabilities that overwhelmed Axis industrial capacity through systematic application of assembly line methods. Fuel production statistics illustrated the resource advantages that determined combat outcomes. American petroleum refineries supplied high-octane aviation gasoline that enabled superior engine performance, while German synthetic fuel programs produced inferior products that limited aircraft capabilities. This quality difference affected combat performance beyond numerical considerations. Pilot training comparisons revealed preparation advantages that translated directly into combat effectiveness. American pilots completed 400 hours of flight training before operational assignment, while German pilots entered combat with fewer than 25 hours due to fuel shortages. This experience gap produced aerial combat results that favored better-prepared American air crews. The mathematical analysis of industrial production revealed that German defeat was statistically inevitable, regardless of tactical innovations or individual pilot skill. American manufacturing advantages grew larger each month as German capacity declined under Allied bombing pressure. Victory became a calculation rather than a military achievement. Technical specifications demonstrated American engineering superiority in aircraft design and manufacturing quality. The North American P-51 Mustang combined long-range, high-performance, and reliability in packages that German aircraft could not match, despite theoretical advantages in specific categories. Economic foundation supporting American war production rested on abundant natural resources and surplus industrial capacity that European nations lacked. Continental petroleum reserves, aluminum production, and steel manufacturing provided material advantages that made sustained high-intensity operations possible without civilian hardship. The Tuskegee Airmen's statistical record provided evidence that professional competence transcended racial prejudice when institutional barriers were removed. Their combat effectiveness demonstrated that talent and dedication existed throughout American society, regardless of artificially imposed limitations. Silence settled over Ramitelli Airfield as the last North American P-51 Mustangs were secured in their protective revetments. The red-painted tails that had become legendary among bomber crews would no longer streak across European skies in defense of Allied formations. Victory in Europe meant the end of combat operations for the Tuskegee Airmen, but their return to America would reveal that one war had ended while another continued. Captain Roscoe Brown packed his personal equipment with the knowledge that his combat record spoke louder than institutional prejudice. The segregated conditions that had defined his military service would follow him home to an America unprepared. To acknowledge the contradiction between fighting fascism abroad while maintaining racial discrimination domestically. The decommissioning process at Ramitelli involved careful inventory of aircraft, equipment, and personal effects accumulated during months of combat operations. Each Mustang represented American industrial capacity that had overwhelmed German production through superior manufacturing techniques and abundant raw materials. The aircraft would be sold as surplus or scrapped despite their proven combat effectiveness. African American pilots faced uncertain futures in a civilian society that had not changed during their absence. The skills they had developed in combat operations had no direct civilian applications, while their military records carried little weight in employment decisions influenced by racial prejudice rather than demonstrated competence. The statistical record of Tuskegee operations provided mathematical evidence of professional achievement that contradicted institutional assumptions about African American capabilities. Their loss rates, kill ratios, and mission success percentages matched or exceeded other 8th Air Force units operating under similar conditions. These numbers represented lives saved and missions accomplished through disciplined execution of tactical responsibilities. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Davis reflected on the dual nature of their service experience. The same institution that had segregated them based on racial prejudice had ultimately depended on their professional competence to accomplish critical military missions. This contradiction highlighted broader American social tensions that would require resolution in peacetime society, the Mediterranean theater. Operations had transformed college-educated young men into combat veterans whose experience transcended racial boundaries. They had flown alongside white bomber crews who depended on their protection, creating bonds that institutional segregation could not eliminate. These relationships suggested possibilities. For social change in post-war America, the transition from combat operations to civilian life would prove challenging for pilots whose wartime service had provided purpose and professional identity. The camaraderie of combat squadrons could not be replicated in civilian employment where individual achievement replaced collective mission. Accomplishment, recognition of their achievements would come slowly through, changing social attitudes rather than immediate institutional acknowledgement. The seeds of civil rights progress had been planted in the statistical evidence of their professional competence, but germination would require decades of continued struggle against entrenched prejudice. Decades later, the Tuskegee Airmen stood in formation at the White House as President George W. Bush presented the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. The ceremony recognized not only their combat achievements, but their role in breaking down racial barriers that had limited American military effectiveness and social progress. The legacy of the Red Tails extended far beyond their statistical combat record. Their professional competence under combat conditions had provided evidence that racial integration would strengthen rather than weaken American military capabilities. This proof influenced President Harry Truman's decision to integrate the armed forces in 1948, beginning institutional changes that would transform American society. The civil rights movement drew inspiration from the Tuskegee example of excellence under adverse conditions. Their combat record demonstrated that artificial barriers limiting African American participation in American institutions harmed national interests while wasting human potential. The mathematical evidence of their achievements could not be dismissed through prejudice or institutional resistance. Modern Air Force doctrine incorporated lessons learned from Tuskegee escort, tactics that emphasized mission accomplishment over individual glory. Their disciplined approach to bomber protection became standard operating procedure for fighter escort operations, proving that tactical innovations developed under segregated conditions could benefit integrated military units. The technological legacy of World War II aviation reflected American industrial advantages that continued into the post-war period. The manufacturing techniques developed at Ford's Willow Run facility influenced commercial aircraft production, while the engineering innovations embodied in the P-51 Mustang shaped fighter aircraft design for decades. Educational programs commemorating Tuskegee Airmen achievements emphasized the connection between individual excellence and systemic change. Their story demonstrated that professional competence could overcome institutional prejudice when supported by measurable evidence of achievement. This lesson applied to broader struggles for social justice and equal opportunity. The strategic lessons of World War II aerial combat validated American approaches to military planning that emphasized industrial capacity over tactical brilliance. The overwhelming numerical advantages that made Allied victory inevitable reflected democratic societies' ability to mobilize resources more effectively than totalitarian regimes despite theoretical efficiency advantages. Contemporary military leadership included officers whose careers had been made possible by the barriers broken by Tuskegee pioneers. General Colin Powell, General Benjamin Davis Jr., and other African American leaders traced their opportunities to the precedent established by Red Tail combat performance during World War II. The international reputation of American military effectiveness rested partly on the integration achieved through Tuskegee example. Foreign allies recognized that American strength came from utilizing talent regardless of artificial social boundaries, making integrated forces more capable than segregated. Alternatives. The memory of the Tuskegee Airmen served as reminder that American strength comes not from martial tradition, but from democratic values that honor merit over prejudice. Their red tails had flown beyond war into the conscience of a nation. If you enjoyed the story, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.